Jasper Creed gripped the noose tighter, his knuckles white. Tonight, he had decided to die until a single, desperate cough from the shadows forced him to choose between death or destiny. Was this the end? Or was there something more to be found in the dust? The ranch had seen better days. The walls of the barn, once sturdy and proud, now sagged in places, weathered by years of sun and storms. The land, once fertile, was now barren, just like the hollow feeling that had settled deep in his chest. The dust of Bitter Springs, a town abandoned by time and luck, seemed to blow in endless spirals around him, mocking the quiet grief that held him captive. His wife, Clara, was gone, and with her, a part of himself had been lost to the earth, buried in a tiny grave behind the house. She had died months ago, her last breath carried away by the dry wind that now whispered across the land. Jasper had long since stopped crying. There had been no tears for days, no prayers whispered into the wind. His fingers trembled on the rough rope, worn smooth from years of use. The same rope that had once tethered the horses he used to tend. The knots were familiar, the motions instinctive. It had been his only purpose for so long, chopping wood, tending the barn, keeping the house from falling apart. But it had all been mechanical, a means of filling the hours with tasks that led nowhere. He had made no plans for the future, had nothing left to live for. He had lived through wars, battles, and the death of loved ones, but nothing had prepared him for the hollow silence that followed Clara's passing. The emptiness had been more than he could bear, and as the days dragged on, it had become clear that there was nothing left for him in this world. It was why he stood here now, on the precipice of his final decision, with the noose in his hands. A decision he felt he was being forced to make. And yet, in the silence, there was something. A faint sound. A rustle. Soft and cautious, coming from beneath the hay bales in the far corner of the barn. Jasper's heart skipped. He froze, his grip tightening on the rope as his sharp ears strained to catch the sound again. It was a cough, a faint, desperate sound. Quickly silenced, as though the person making it was afraid of being heard. For a long moment, the barn held its breath. Then, a soft whimper, almost imperceptible against the wind. His stomach tightened. Nobody came around these parts, not without reason. His eyes narrowed, a soldier's instincts kicking in as he slowly lowered the noose and moved toward the sound. The wind creaked through the barn, as if nature itself was holding its breath. The barn had always been a refuge for him, a place where he could work with his hands and forget the ache in his soul. But now, it was more than that. It was a place where something, or someone, was hiding. The creak of his boots echoed in the silence as he crossed the barn floor, moving slowly, his boots scuffing against the straw and dust. His hands found the handle of the pitchfork, but he did not raise it in aggression. He was no fool. No one sane would hide in another man's barn, unless they were either desperate or up to no good. He moved closer to the hay bales, his breath shallow. As he rounded the corner, he caught sight of the huddle of bodies, an old, disheveled woman clinging to her children, each one trembling with fear. 5 of them. The woman looked up, her eyes wide and frightened, but she made no move to speak. The children, all under the age of 12, stared up at him, their faces gaunt with hunger and fear. The woman's voice trembled. "Please, please don't make us leave." Jasper blinked, the words falling over him like a weight. His hand, still clutching the pitchfork, slowly fell to his side as he stood frozen, the reality of the situation slowly dawning on him. His gaze flicked over the children, their raw, dirty feet, their torn clothing, and his heart clenched. They were no threat. That much was clear. Just people in need. "I thought this place was abandoned," the woman continued, her voice quivering. "I didn't know anyone still lived here." Jasper took a slow, steady breath. His instinct screamed at him to be cautious, to turn them away, to return to the emptiness he had grown so accustomed to. But there was something in her eyes, something that reminded him of Clara, of the woman who had once looked at him with the same kind of silent hope, the hope that maybe, just maybe, there was something worth living for. Without a word, Jasper lowered the pitchfork, then stepped back, gesturing toward the house. "You can stay," he said, his voice hoarse. "I can't promise much, but you can stay." The woman seemed to hesitate, as though she did not believe him. But after a long pause, she nodded. She did not ask for food, for shelter, for anything. She just gathered her children close, as if to protect them from the world outside. Jasper didn't speak again as he led them toward the house. It felt like a dream, something that had come out of nowhere, a reminder that there were still people in this world who needed help. But what did he have left to offer a broken home, a broken heart, and the ghost of a wife buried just outside? The small cabin was cold, the fire long since gone out, the hearth empty. But that didn't matter. It had been days since Jasper had felt the weight of another person in the house. The silence too heavy, too suffocating. As he stoked the fire, the woman whose name was Seraphina Holloway set to work with her children, gathering wood, tidying up the small space. They moved with a quiet efficiency, as though they had done this all their lives. Jasper didn't know what to say to them, what words could break the thick tension between them. So, he simply worked in silence. The woman, Seraphina, watched him, her eyes filled with a cautious gratitude. When the fire was stoked and a pot of beans simmered on the stove, she finally spoke again. "Thank you," she said softly, her voice breaking the quiet. "We've been running for weeks. My husband, he died last year, and I thought we were free of him. But his debts, they followed us. He left us with nothing but fear." Jasper looked up, his expression unreadable. He said nothing for a long moment, just stared at her, the weight of her words sinking in. "Who's chasing you?" he asked quietly, the question slipping out before he could stop it. Her eyes filled with a deep, dark sadness. "His name is Cole Blackthorne," she said. "He was a loan shark in Missouri. My husband borrowed money from him to get us out west. And when my husband died, Cole wanted it back. He said we'd pay it off. Or..." She trailed off, her voice shaking. Jasper didn't need to hear more. He understood. The kind of man who chased a woman and children over debts was the kind of man who wouldn't stop until he got what he wanted. But there was something in the way Seraphina spoke, the way she held herself. She had fought before. He could see that. "Where's he now?" Jasper asked, his voice low. Seraphina hesitated, then looked down. "He's close. I thought we lost him, but I should have known he wouldn't give up." If Cole Blackthorne was as ruthless as she said, why hadn't he killed them already? Jasper couldn't shake the feeling Cole wanted more than just money. But what Jasper felt something stir in him, something he hadn't felt in a long time. The old soldier within him, the one who had fought wars, who had seen death and destruction, who had buried more men than he cared to remember, stirred inside him once more. They weren't just running from Cole Blackthorn. They were running from something deeper, something far more dangerous. Jasper stood slowly, his mind racing. He knew the man he had once been, the man who had fought to the end for those who needed him, who had never turned away from a fight. But this was different. This wasn't a battle of nations or of armies. This was a battle for survival. "We'll take care of it," Jasper said, his voice quiet but firm. The night passed in silence, each of them lost in their own thoughts. As the wind howled outside, Serafina and her children settled near the stove, their weary bodies finally finding rest. But as Jasper sat by the fire, his eyes on the embers that were beginning to die down, a thought crept into his mind, a thought that hadn't been there before, one he hadn't allowed himself to entertain in months. Maybe he could find something worth living for again. And as the night settled, the quiet weight of the noose still hung in the barn, a ghost of a decision he had almost made. But for now, there was something else to think about. As Serafina asked, "Please don't make us leave," Jasper, still holding the noose, hesitated, unsure if he was ready to take on the responsibility of helping them. The question hung in the air, signaling the start of a difficult choice. Jasper sat by the stove, watching the fire crackle, the smell of beans filling the room. The warmth of the fire did little to thaw the cold weight in his chest. But for the first time in days, the silence wasn't suffocating. It was a quiet, tentative peace, a momentary pause that felt fragile, like the calm before a storm. The firelight flickered across the room, casting long shadows over the faded furniture, the once bright patterns of the quilts now worn and muted. The cabin, like everything else in Bitter Springs, seemed to hold on by a thread-cracked wood and empty walls, a place where memories clung to the air like dust, too heavy to ignore. But in that moment, as the faint scent of the beans filled the room, it was the first time in months that Jasper could breathe without the weight of his own grief crushing him. Beside him, Serafina moved quietly, gathering the children into a corner of the room, where they huddled close, exhausted but alert. The soft murmur of her voice, comforting her youngest, broke the silence in a way that felt almost foreign to Jasper. He wasn't used to it, the sound of a family trying to rebuild after everything had been torn apart. "Thank you, Mr. Creed," Serafina said quietly, turning back toward him as she straightened the worn sheets. "You've given us more than we could have asked for." Jasper didn't know how to respond. The words didn't seem to come as easily as they used to. He had once been a man of action, of orders and missions, but now he was just a man trying to keep the silence from swallowing him whole. He nodded, offering nothing more than a grunt, as he reached over to stir the beans again. His hand hovered above the pot for a moment, his thoughts drifting. The woman's gratitude was overwhelming, and yet it left him unsettled. He didn't want her thanks. He didn't want any of this. All he had ever wanted was the peace that came from being alone. And yet, for some reason, her family had arrived uninvited, and now he couldn't bring himself to turn them away. The wind howled outside, rattling the shutters, reminding him that they were far from safe. Serafina's presence in his cabin brought an uncomfortable truth to the surface he couldn't hide from his past forever. And yet, he found himself drawn to her, a woman who, despite everything she had been through, still managed to keep her family intact, still had hope in her eyes, even as the world around them crumbled. He pushed the thought away. Now wasn't the time for thinking about hope or change. He had a new problem to face. Cole Blackthorne was still out there, hunting them. Serafina had made it clear that her past was one full of regret and fear, and that Cole's reach extended far beyond her. He wasn't a man who would stop until he got what he wanted. Jasper cleared his throat, breaking the silence that had settled over them like a heavy fog. You said you've been running from him for weeks. Serafina stiffened for a moment, and for a brief second, Jasper thought she might shut down again. But instead, she met his gaze, her eyes dark with something unspoken. We've been moving ever since my husband died. Cole isn't just a debt collector, he's a predator. A man who doesn't care who he hurts as long as he gets what he's owed. Jasper didn't reply right away. He had known men like that. He had fought alongside men who had the same hunger in their eyes, the kind of men who would do anything for the sake of power, for control. But he had never seen it like this. Never had it come so close, so personally. I won't let him take you, he said, his voice low, a promise made to the wind as much as to her. He could feel the weight of his own words, the reality of them sinking in. He wasn't just offering refuge, he was offering a battle. Serafina looked down, her shoulders sagging slightly as she gathered her children closer. But there was a flicker in her eyes, something like hope, but tempered with fear. She had seen too much to believe in miracles, too much to trust that things could ever go back to normal. I wish I could believe you, she whispered. But Cole isn't like other men. You can't stop him, not once he's set his sights on you. Jasper felt the coldness of her words settle in his chest. But he didn't flinch. He had faced worse than men like Cole Blackthorne. He had seen men break, seen them beg for mercy, and still had to pull the trigger. He wasn't afraid of men like Cole. But fear was something different. It was the quiet panic in the back of his mind, the one that whispered to him that no matter how hard he fought, there was always something darker waiting just behind the door. I've been a soldier, he said, more to himself than to Serafina. I've fought wars, and I know how to handle men like him. Her eyes flicked to him, a glimmer of understanding passing between them. She had been through enough to know when someone was lying, and Jasper wasn't lying. He had the weight of his own demons to face, but for the first time in months, he felt like he might be able to do something, anything. The children were silent, their faces pale and drawn with exhaustion. Ivy, the oldest girl, no more than 12, was staring at him with wide eyes, trying to figure him out. The other children were no different. They looked at him like he was a stranger, like they had seen too much to trust anyone. But Ivy was the first to speak, her voice small but determined. Are we going to stay here? She asked. Jasper nodded, though a part of him wasn't sure if they would even be safe by morning. But there was something in her voice that made him want to keep them safe. And so, he nodded again. You'll stay here for now. I'll keep you safe. Serafina's gaze softened, but it was still guarded, as if she was afraid to let herself trust him. Thank you, Mr. Creed, she said again, her voice full of gratitude but also exhaustion. You've given us shelter, but I can't ask you to fight for us. Jasper turned away, his back to her as he stared at the fire. I don't plan on asking for your thanks, he said quietly. I'm not doing this for you. I'm doing it for them. The night settled around them, the fire crackling as the wind outside howled louder, and the world beyond the walls seemed to grow colder. Jasper lay in the dark, the weight of his promise pressing heavily on him. He didn't know what tomorrow would bring, but he knew he couldn't walk away. Not now. His thoughts were interrupted by the faint sound of something, a distant thud, echoing through the night air. Jasper's heart skipped a beat. He pushed himself out of the bed, silently moving toward the door, his hand instinctively reaching for the rifle that hung by the door. And then, from outside, he heard it again, the unmistakable sound of hooves. Someone was coming. He turned to Serafina, who had already risen, her face pale with fear. She knew who it was, too. As Jasper stepped toward the door, the sound of hooves grew louder. He turned to Serafina and whispered, "They've found us." The morning light broke over the land, harsh and unforgiving. Jasper stood by the barn, scanning the horizon for any sign of danger. But it was the footprints in the dirt near his barn that gnawed at his gut. The tracks were fresh, deep, deliberate impressions. 4 sets of them. One set was heavier, spaced wider apart, a man's stride, probably on horseback. The others were smaller, uneven, and more hurried. Jasper's breath caught as he crouched, running his calloused fingers over the dirt, tracing the edges of the prints as if they were some kind of omen. He had always been a man of few words, but the silence of the morning seemed to speak louder now, like the land itself was warning him. "Whoever has been here wasn't just passing through," he muttered under his breath, his mind racing. He stood up slowly, his gaze locked on the direction the tracks led. His stomach tightened as he realized the worst of it. The tracks led straight to his barn, to the place where Serafina and her children were hiding. His pulse quickened. He wasn't just facing an unknown threat. He was facing Cole Blackthorne. The wind kicked up, sweeping dust across the hard-packed dirt of the yard. It hadn't rained in weeks, and the land was bone dry. Jasper ran a hand through his hair, his mind working fast. He didn't have much time. Cole and his men were close. Serafina and her children weren't safe here anymore. But Jasper wasn't going to let them take them, not after everything he had already sacrificed. He had made a promise, and that promise wasn't just words. It was a vow. He straightened, his eyes narrowing as he scanned the hills, the barren trees standing like sentinels along the edge of the property. Nothing moved. The air hung still, too still. As Jasper made his way back toward the house, he felt something shift inside him, a sense of duty, a renewed purpose. He wasn't just an isolated man anymore. He wasn't the ghost of the man he used to be. He was a protector now, a man with something to fight for. He opened the door to find Serafina already awake. Her back was turned as she tended to the stove, stirring the remnants of the beans he had made the night before. She didn't look up when he entered, her focus fixed on the task at hand. Her hands moved with a practiced ease, but Jasper could see the tension in her shoulders. He knew she hadn't slept well, knew that the fear for her children was written across her face in ways that no words could describe. "Cole Blackthorne is coming," he said quietly, his voice steady despite the turmoil raging inside him. At his words, she froze. The spoon clattered against the pot as she turned to face him, her face pale, her eyes wide with fear. "How do you know?" she whispered, her voice barely audible, as though speaking louder would somehow make it more real. "The track's outside," he replied, his voice low. "He's close. We've got to move." For a moment, neither of them spoke. The weight of the situation settled between them, heavy and unyielding. Serafina swallowed hard, looking away, but the edge of her jaw tightened with determination. She wasn't ready to show her fear, not in front of her children, not in front of him. But Jasper knew. She was as afraid as he was, maybe more. Cole wasn't a man who let things go, and he wasn't a man who would stop until he got what he wanted. "Where will we go?" Serafina asked, her voice trembling. Jasper didn't have an answer for that. He had no plan, no escape route. He had never thought this far ahead. The truth of it hit him. Then he had been living in the past, stuck in the grief of what he had lost. But now, for the first time in a long while, he was facing the future, and the future, as he saw it, was uncertain, dangerous. The land stretched before him, empty and unforgiving, just like the choices ahead. "We can't stay here," he said finally, his voice rough with the weight of the decision. "But we can't run either. We'll have to face him." Serafina nodded, though her face showed no sign of comfort. She turned back to the stove, her hands moving in quiet, rhythmic motions. But Jasper could see the way her fingers trembled as they stirred the beans. It wasn't the kind of trembling that came from fear alone. It was the kind of trembling that came from years of survival. The kind of trembling that came from knowing how much was at stake. "Get the children ready," he said, his voice quieter now, but still firm. "We need to leave. Now." As the morning stretched on, the house fell into an uneasy rhythm. The children helped gather what little they could: blankets, a few tin cans of food, anything that could be carried. Jasper didn't know how much of a head start they had. He didn't know how far ahead Cole and his men were, but he knew they couldn't afford to waste any more time. The family moved quickly, not a word spoken between them, only the sound of rustling and hurried footsteps as they packed the old wagon. Jasper had an old mule that he used for hauling firewood, but it wasn't much for a long journey. Still, it was better than walking. The children didn't speak. Samuel, the oldest boy, kept his eyes fixed on the horizon, his small hands gripping the edge of the wagon as if he was already preparing himself for the fight that was coming. His quiet determination reminded Jasper of his own younger self, the boy he had once been, the soldier who had faced battles with the same unflinching resolve. Jasper watched Serafina as she finished packing the last of their things. She was trying to keep it together, trying to protect her children, but he could see the exhaustion in her eyes. She wasn't just running from Cole, she was running from everything that had come before him, from a life of fear, of betrayal, of loss. She had been running for so long, and Jasper knew that no matter how far they went, Cole would still find a way to catch them. "I've seen men like him before," Jasper said, his voice low as he approached her. "He won't stop. He'll keep coming until we're all dead, or he gets what he wants." Serafina didn't reply. She didn't have to. The pain in her eyes spoke volumes. The sun was high in the sky when Jasper led the mule and wagon toward the far edge of the property, his eyes scanning the distance. There was nothing but the dry, dusty hills stretching on for miles, the sparse trees and scattered rocks offering little shelter. The town of Bitter Springs loomed in the distance behind them, once a bustling outpost for travelers, now nothing more than a ghost town. There were no signs of life, no smoke rising from chimneys, no people walking along the dusty streets. It was a place that had been forgotten by time, just like the people who had once lived there. As they reached the edge of the property, Jasper paused, his hand gripping the reins of the mule. He stared into the distance, his mind racing. Cole Blackthorne was coming, and they needed a plan. But there was no plan. Not yet. There was only survival. And for the first time, Jasper realized that his past no longer mattered. What mattered now was protecting the future, protecting Serafina and her children, no matter the cost. Then, out of the corner of his eye, he saw at the flicker of movement in the distance, a dark shape against the sun. He squinted, his pulse quickening. Someone was coming. They weren't alone anymore. Jasper's heart sank as the figure in the distance became clearer. Cole Blackthorne had found them. A low thunder of hooves rolled closer, each beat hammering against the dry earth like a war drum, and Jasper gripped his rifle. Every decision felt carved into his bones, as if the land itself demanded payment for every life he took. Tonight, the land would either break him or make him. The fire in the hearth had long since burned down to embers, and the cabin lay in a blanket of darkness, save for the faint glow of the moon that filtered through the windows. The wind howled outside, rattling the loose panes and tugging at the dry leaves that skittered across the yard. But inside, there was only the heavy silence, thick with the weight of the decision that now hung over Jasper's head. He moved quietly through the cabin, the worn floorboards creaking beneath his boots. The children were asleep, scattered in their blankets near the stove, huddled together for warmth. Serafina sat near the fire, her face drawn and tired, her eyes watching the flickering light. Her presence was a strange comfort to Jasper, though there was a distance between them that neither of them seemed willing to cross. She had never fully opened up to him, never spoken of her past in any great detail. But he knew enough. He had seen the fear in her eyes, the same fear that gnawed at his insides, the fear of an unstoppable force closing in, a storm he couldn't outrun. Cole Blackthorne had been the shadow lurking in the background of Serafina's life, a man she had tried to escape for years. But no matter how far she ran, no matter how many times she changed direction, the shadow had always followed. Jasper didn't know the full extent of Cole's cruelty, but he could see it in Serafina's tired eyes, in the way she flinched when the wind moaned outside, in the way she kept her children close, as if protecting them from something worse than hunger or cold. Tonight, though, the storm was real. He reached the door of the cabin and paused, staring out into the stillness of the night. The land stretched out before him, empty and barren, the silhouette of Bloodstone Ridge looming in the distance. The silence was unnerving, a heavy kind of stillness that made the hairs on the back of his neck stand on end. It was a silence he knew too well before the battle, before the fight. There was always this moment of stillness, the calm before the chaos. A flicker of movement caught his eye. At first, it was only a shadow, a trick of the light, but then it came again clearer. This time, a dark figure moving slowly, deliberately through the fields. Jasper squinted, his breath catching as he recognized the shape. It was Cole Blackthorne, or at least one of his men. The moment he'd been dreading had come. The man they had been running from for so long had finally found them. The thought sent a chill through Jasper's bones. But he didn't hesitate. He grabbed the rifle from its place near the door and stepped outside, the cold air biting into his skin as he made his way toward the barn. His boots crunched in the dry dirt, and every step seemed to echo in the silence. He had known this day would come, but now that it was here, the weight of it felt like a mountain pressing down on his chest. He wasn't just fighting for survival anymore. He was fighting for something more than that, a second chance at life, at purpose, at redemption. He didn't know what that future looked like, but he couldn't let Cole Blackthorne take it from him. Not now. Not when he had just started to feel the stirrings of something worth living for again. The barn loomed ahead of him, dark and still, its doors creaking slightly in the wind. As Jasper approached, he could hear the soft sounds of movement inside Serafina and her children preparing for the worst, just as he had. She knew, deep down, that Cole wouldn't stop until he had what he wanted, inside. Jasper found the family gathered around, their faces pale with fear. The children were quiet, their eyes wide and watchful, while Serafina stood by the window, her face tense. She didn't need to say a word. Jasper could see it in her eyes, the same realization that had come to him as he'd seen Cole's figure in the distance. The end was near. "We need to move," Jasper said, his voice calm but firm. "We can't stay here." Serafina turned to him, her face etched with worry. "Where will we go?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. "Where can we hide from him?" Jasper didn't have an answer. He had no safe haven, no place to run. The land was vast, but it was also unforgiving. There was nowhere far enough to escape the kind of man Cole Blackthorne was. But still, they had to move. They had to fight. "I'll keep you safe," he said simply, though the words felt hollow even to him. How could he promise something like that when he didn't even know if he could keep his own family safe? But it was all he had left to offer his word. The children stood up, their tired faces filled with uncertainty. But there was no fear in their eyes now. Samuel, the oldest boy, looked at Jasper with a quiet determination, his small hands gripping the edge of the wagon. "Where do we go, Mr. Creed?" he asked, his voice small but steady. Jasper hesitated, his thoughts racing. They couldn't go far. But there was one place he could think of, an old trading post to the north, a place he'd passed on his way to Bitter Springs. It wasn't much, but it was a place where they might have a chance, at least for a little while. "We head north," he said finally. "There's a place just a few miles out. We'll get there before dawn." Serafina nodded, though her face was filled with doubt. "And what if they follow us?" Jasper turned to look at her, his eyes steely. "They will," he said. "But I won't let them take you." The wagon creaked beneath them as they gathered what they could carry, nothing more than a few essentials. The rest of their lives packed into a haphazard heap. The children sat close, their eyes wide with exhaustion, but also with something else, resilience. Jasper had seen it in men before, the will to survive, the instinct to fight when everything else seemed lost. And now, it was in these children, too. As they moved through the quiet night, Jasper kept his eyes on the hills, his hand resting on the rifle at his side. The air was cold, biting into his skin, but his thoughts were somewhere else on the road ahead, on the shadow of Cole Blackthorne that loomed behind them. The land stretched before them, vast and open. But Jasper felt the weight of every step. This wasn't just about getting away. It was about fighting for something worth holding on to. A future. A family. They hadn't gone far when the sound of hooves reached their ears, distant at first, but unmistakable. Jasper's heart raced as he turned to Serafina, his eyes filled with determination. "They're here," he said, his voice firm. Jasper turned to face the children, his hand gripping the rifle. "Get ready," he said, his voice low. "We're about to fight for our lives." The sound of hooves echoed across the dry land, cutting through the silence like a blade. Jasper gripped his rifle tighter, feeling the cold steel settle into his hands. The weight of it was both familiar and foreign, an old companion, now more of a necessity than a comfort. It was strange to be standing in the shadow of Bloodstone Ridge, not as a man seeking refuge, but as one preparing for a fight. The horizon stretched wide and open before him, the moon hanging low, casting long shadows across the land. It was a beautiful night, but there was no time for beauty now. The wind picked up, kicking dust into the air, and with it came the unmistakable sound of riders moving closer. Jasper stood still, his eyes narrowing as he focused on the sound of the hooves. There were at least 4, maybe 5 men coming his way. Cole Blackthorn and his gang weren't far behind. He turned toward the wagon, where Seraphina and the children were preparing to leave. Their faces were a mix of exhaustion and fear, but there was something else in their eyes, now a quiet resolve. The kind of resolve that only came from knowing what it meant to survive. They were no longer just running from the past. They were running toward a future they couldn't afford to lose. "Jasper, what do we do now?" Seraphina's voice broke through his thoughts, steady despite the tension in the air. He didn't answer right away. He had no plan, no strategy, no escape. The land was too open, too exposed. There were no hills to hide behind, no forests to lose themselves in. The only thing they had now was Jasper's word. And maybe, just maybe, that would be enough. "We fight," he said finally, his voice low but firm. "We stand our ground." He could see Seraphina's hesitation, the flicker of doubt in her eyes. She had been running for too long, always looking over her shoulder, always waiting for Cole Blackthorn to catch up with them. But this time, she had nowhere to run. Jasper knew that now this was the moment where they either faced the past head-on or ran from it forever. "Jasper, we can't just stand here," she said, her voice cracking. "They'll kill us." Jasper's eyes softened for a brief moment, but he didn't break his gaze from the ridge. "They'll have to get through me first," he muttered. The wagon was packed, the children huddled close, their faces pale but determined. Samuel stood at the front, his small hands gripping the edge of the wagon as if he, too, was preparing for battle. Ivy had taken a seat beside him, her eyes darting nervously between Jasper and the distant ridge. The other children were quiet, their fear too great to voice, their uncertainty too much to bear. Jasper moved quickly, checking the wagon's wheels, making sure the mule was secure. The last thing they needed was the mule running off in the middle of a fight. He glanced back at Seraphina, who was kneeling beside the children, her eyes filled with a quiet desperation. She had made it clear that she didn't want anyone to get hurt, not her children, not Jasper, not even herself. But sometimes, the world had a way of forcing people into positions they weren't ready for. And now, they were about to face that reality. The distant sound of hooves grew louder, closer. Jasper could see the men now, silhouettes against the night sky, their horses moving in steady formation. It was a slow march, but it was deliberate. Cole Blackthorn was no fool. He had come for them, and he wasn't leaving until he had what he wanted. Jasper stepped forward, his boots crunching on the dry ground, his rifle raised and aimed at the sky. He didn't intend to fire just yet. He wasn't ready to make the first move, but the men were closing in. There was no room left for hesitation. His time was running out. The men arrived in a line, their horses trotting slowly until they stopped just a few yards away from Jasper. Cole Blackthorn sat at the front, a tall man with sharp features and a scar running down the left side of his face. His eyes were cold, calculating, like a predator watching its prey. He didn't speak at first, his eyes scanning Jasper, the children, and the wagon. His gaze lingered on Serafina, and something dark flickered behind his eyes. Jasper Creed. I presume Cole's voice was smooth, like silk, but there was no warmth in it, only the chill of something far darker. Jasper didn't answer immediately. He stood tall, his rifle still raised but not aimed directly at Cole. The air between them was thick with tension, each of them waiting for the other to make the first move. The silence stretched long, the only sound the wind and the soft scraping of the mule's hooves against the dirt. "I'm not going to hand them over." "Blackthorn," Jasper finally said, his voice steady, calm, despite the storm raging inside him. "You're going to have to take them from me." Cole's lips curled into a cruel smile, his eyes flicking toward the children, who had grown deathly quiet in the wagon. "I don't want them, Creed," he said, his tone cold. "I want her." He nodded toward Serafina, his gaze lingering on her for just a moment longer than necessary. Jasper could feel the anger rising in his chest, the protective instinct flaring to life like a spark. Cole wasn't just here for the money. He was here to finish what he had started. And that, more than anything, was what Jasper couldn't let happen. Not again. "You can't have her," Jasper growled, his finger tightening on the trigger of the rifle. "Not now. Not ever." Cole's smile faded, and he motioned for the men behind him to dismount. They were ready to fight, ready to take what they wanted, by force if necessary. "Last chance, Creed," Cole said, his voice low and dangerous. "Hand her over now, and I'll let you walk away with your life." But Jasper didn't hesitate. He wasn't a man who would turn away from a fight, not when the stakes were this high. The battle began with a flash. Jasper fired first, his shot ringing through the night air and striking the ground near Cole's feet. It wasn't meant to kill, just to send a message. Cole flinched, but he didn't back down. The rest of his men scattered, reaching for their guns, the sound of metal against leather ringing out as they prepared for the fight. The air was thick with dust and gunpowder, the sounds of horses neighing and men shouting echoing across the land. Jasper kept his focus, moving fast, his rifle up and ready. He had no time for fear. The only thing that mattered was protecting the family behind him. The first man charged at him, his horse kicking up dirt as he came. Jasper fired again, the shot hitting the man's horse, sending the animal tumbling to the ground. The rider was thrown, landing with a sickening thud in the dirt. He wasn't moving. Another man fired, the bullet missing Jasper by mere inches. The sound of gunfire filled the air, the night coming alive with chaos. Jasper fired back, narrowly missing, but causing his opponent to retreat behind a boulder. Cole, meanwhile, remained silent, watching, waiting for the right moment to strike. Jasper could feel the tension building, his heart pounding in his chest as Cole Blackthorn slowly dismounted from his horse, a grim look on his face. He was coming for Jasper now, and Jasper knew it wasn't going to end without a price. Cole's voice cut through the air like a knife. "You've made your choice, Creed. Now, you'll pay for it." As the sun rose over the bloodied earth, Jasper felt the weight of the moment settle deep within him. The fight was over, but the cost was heavy. The land stretched wide before him. The rugged hills bathed in the soft light of dawn. The night had been long and brutal, the earth soaked in dust and blood, the echoes of gunfire still ringing in his ears. But now, as the first rays of sunlight touched the battlefield, there was a strange quiet, a peace that felt foreign, like the calm after a storm. It wasn't a peace that brought comfort, though it was the kind of peace that came from survival, from having fought to the bitter end and found a way to live through it. Jasper stood by the barn, his eyes scanning the horizon. The smoke from the battle still lingered in the air, a reminder of what had happened. His hand rested on the rifle, the familiar weight grounding him. But there was something different about it now. Something that felt both heavier and lighter than it ever had before. The sound of hooves on the dry ground reached his ears. Distant at first, but unmistakable. He didn't need to turn around to know who it was. He had felt it in his bones, the moment Cole Blackthorne had ridden onto the land. Cole Blackthorne lay face down in the dirt, a dark stain spreading beneath him. His chest rose once, then stilled forever. Jasper lowered his rifle, his breath ragged. Knowing the fight was truly over, Jasper's gaze shifted toward the barn, where Seraphina and her children were gathering, ready to move on. The battle had been hard, but they had survived. The family he had promised to protect was still intact. And now, as the light of day filled the world, they were free to leave the shadows of the past behind. The wind shifted, cool and quiet, carrying with it the scent of the earth and the promise of something new. But Jasper didn't feel the relief he thought he would. He had won the fight, but the war inside him was far from over. Seraphina stepped out of the cabin, her eyes scanning the scene before her. The battle had left its mark on her, too. She had seen the violence, the bloodshed, but still, she was standing here, her back straight, her head held high. For a moment, she just stood there, watching the sun rise, the weight of the past lifting just a little. "You did it," she said quietly, her voice almost a whisper. "You kept us safe." Jasper nodded, but the words felt empty. He had kept them safe. Yes. But at what cost? The bodies of Cole's men lay scattered in the dirt behind him, their lives snuffed out by the violence that had come to this land, to these people. Jasper had never wanted this, never wanted to be the one to fight, to kill. But he had made a choice, and that choice had led them here, to this moment. "You didn't have to do it alone," Seraphina added, her eyes soft but filled with something deeper, something that had been there since the moment they met, the moment he had stepped into the barn. She had seen him change. She had seen him grow from a man who was ready to give up to a man who had fought for something. For someone. Jasper didn't respond at first. The words were hard to find, harder to say. He had fought for her children, but he had also fought for something inside himself. He had fought to find meaning again, to find a reason to live. "I wasn't alone," he finally said, his voice hoarse. "Not anymore." The children were already moving, helping to pack the last of their things. Samuel stood by the wagon, his eyes scanning the land with the quiet watchfulness of a boy who had learned far too much too quickly. He wasn't the same boy who had first arrived here, scared and unsure. No. Now he was a boy who had seen what it took to survive. And it had changed him. Ivy and the others were busy gathering their belongings, the air filled with the sounds of movement, of preparing for what came next. Jasper watched them for a moment, his heart heavy. He wasn't just a protector anymore. He was part of something that had taken root in him, deep in his soul. And as much as he wanted to turn away from it, to slip back into the shadows of his grief and isolation, he couldn't. They needed him. And, in some strange way, he needed them, too. He turned back toward Seraphina, who was looking at him with quiet understanding. She didn't need to say anything. She knew. They both knew what had been lost and what had been gained. The path ahead wasn't easy, but they were no longer alone. The wagon was ready, and Jasper helped Serafina climb into the seat. The children followed, each of them taking their place, as if this had become their new reality. They weren't running anymore. They were moving forward, together. Jasper stood by the wagon, looking down at the land one last time. The barn that had once seemed like a place of solitude now felt like a prison. The house where he had buried Clara felt like a tomb, filled with memories of a life that had slipped through his fingers. But there was nothing left to hold on to there. Not anymore. The only thing left to do was to move forward, to find a place where they could build something new, something that would stand on its own, free from the shadows of the past. "Where are we headed?" Serafina asked, her voice soft. "North," Jasper said. "To a place where we can start over. A place where Cole can't find us." The wagon creaked as it began to move, slowly at first, the mule pulling it steadily through the dry land. Behind them, the town of Bitter Springs faded into the distance, nothing more than a memory now. The road ahead was long, but it was theirs to walk, to travel. And for the first time in a long while, Jasper didn't feel the ghosts of his past clawed at him, whispering that he'd never escape what he had been. For the first time, he felt the possibility of something new, something worth fighting for. As they moved farther from the town, the land stretched wide before them, the silence broken only by the sound of the mule's hooves on the dirt and the soft hum of the wind. Jasper turned his eyes to the horizon, where the mountains loomed in the distance, their jagged peaks sharp against the sky. He had once believed that peace was something unattainable. He had believed that life was just a series of battles, each one harder than the last, each one stripping away a part of him. But now, as he looked toward the future, he understood that peace wasn't something to be found. It was something to be built, and in that moment, he realized that Serafina and her children weren't just a part of that future. They were the reason for it. They traveled for hours, the land slowly changing as they moved farther from Bitter Springs. The sun rose higher in the sky, the warmth of the day beginning to fill the air. But Jasper couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching them, that danger was still close, even though Cole and his men were now far behind. Then, just as the light began to fade, they reached the edge of a narrow ravine, a place where the land dropped sharply into a valley below. Jasper stopped the wagon, his eyes scanning the hills. There was a flicker of movement, something in the distance, just beyond the trees. Jasper's hand instinctively went to the rifle by his side. He couldn't shake the feeling that they weren't alone. And then, from the shadows, a figure emerged. Jasper's heart skipped a beat as the figure drew closer, and he recognized the unmistakable outline of Cole Blackthorn's horse. Jasper's hand tightened around the rifle as he scanned the hills, but there was nothing, only the fading echo of the battle and the stillness of the dead. Cole Blackthorn would never return. As the sun finally dipped behind the hills, casting the land in a soft twilight glow, Jasper stood still, his weathered face turned toward the horizon, his heart heavy with memories of days gone by. He could hear the wind whisper through the tall grasses, a sound as familiar as his own name, yet it carried with it something different now, something softer. The haunting echoes of the past seemed to fade with the cool evening breeze, leaving only the steady sound of horses' hooves on the dirt, rhythmic, like a heart that beats through time. He thought of the days when he had walked this land with Clara, their lives tangled with promises, hopes, and dreams, now long buried beneath the soil. He thought of the children, Serafina's children, who had known the weight of the world's cruelty, yet still managed to smile, still found light in the darkness. And in the quiet of the evening, the memory of Cole Blackthorne now lay buried with him beneath the dust, fading like the last stars in the morning sky. They had faced him, endured him, and survived. But the survival had never been the victory. It was the strength to rise again after the fight that truly mattered. In that silence, Jasper thought of what they had fought for, what all men, women, and children truly sought when the dust settled and the noise died down. It wasn't land, nor riches, nor fame. It was peace. It was a place to rest, a place to rebuild, a place to leave behind the ghosts of the past. There were no banners raised for their struggle, no medals awarded. No one would ever speak of it except for the ones who had lived through it, the ones who would carry the weight of it long after the last ember of the fire had burned out. And yet, that quiet fight had been as necessary as any battle in history. For honor, once lost, could always be reclaimed. Jasper, standing in the soft light, had learned that justice may be slow to arrive, but it was never without meaning. Serafina had known that, too, as she sat beside her children, their hands finally free from the shackles of a life they hadn't chosen, their faces bright with the kind of quiet joy that only comes when survival is no longer the goal. But a new beginning is. And what of the woman they had saved, the one whose name had once been whispered in fear, now carried with honor in their hearts, the forgotten woman, Serafina, who had survived not just for herself, but for a generation who needed to learn the truth of kindness and resilience. She wasn't just a victim of circumstances. She was the strength that would teach her children to carry forward what had been lost. Her story, like all stories, had its shadows. But now it was a story of redemption, of the humanity that rises in the face of cruelty. It was a story of forgiveness, too, for the world had shown no mercy to her. But in the end, mercy had found her, not in the form of a grand victory, but in the simple act of survival, and in the kindness she now had a chance to pass on. The truth of her life, the truth of what Jasper had done, didn't need to be accepted by the world. It just needed to be held by one person who believed in it enough to carry it forward. The land they rode through now, wide and open, seemed endless. But it was no longer a place of fear. It was a place to begin again. Jasper turned his face toward the rising sun, his heart still heavy, but with something more now. He had lost much in his life, too much, but standing here, watching the land that had once felt like a cage, he saw it differently. It was a land that could still give something back. And it wasn't just about the land. It was about what lay beyond it. What had been lost had been found again in the simple joy of Serafina's children laughing, in the quiet strength of a woman who had lived with scars, but whose future was finally her own. And for Jasper, who had once thought the earth had no more use for him, this was the redemption. This was the gift of another chance, a chance to keep going, to keep building, to keep finding new roads, no matter how long it took. And now, as the sun began to dip lower, casting long shadows across the land, Jasper knew one thing for certain: he had done what he was meant to do. The fight had been worth it, not because they had won, but because they had lived through it. They had made it. The land that had once seemed endless and empty now stretched before them as a promise, a quiet testament to the strength that ran deeper than the dust, deeper than the scars left on their hearts. As the light faded, Jasper turned to the rest of them, the small family he had chosen to protect, and he spoke, his voice slow, as if savoring the words. If you still believe in the things that can't be seen, in the things that can't be measured, honor, kindness, forgiveness, then leave a mark. Leave a sign that says you're still here, that you believe too. And as the firelight flickered and the night settled in around them, Jasper knew this no matter what happened next. The world they had built together would live on. The world of Seraphina and her children. The world of kindness and strength in the face of everything that tried to tear it apart would live on. It would live on in the stories that people would whisper around campfires, in the quiet moments when someone thought no one was listening. But as the wind swept through the wildflowers, Jasper couldn't ignore the distant cry of a lone crow, a sound that reminded him some battles never truly end. If you, too, still believe in what can't always be seen, what can't always be touched or held, then let your mark be made. If the stories of the Old West stir something in you, if you still believe in the quiet strength of those who fought, not for glory, but for what was right then, take a moment to leave your sign. If this story spoke to you, if the values of honor, redemption, and kindness still matter, then type 1 and join us on the next journey, in the next chapter of Western Story Chronicles. The road may be long, but together, we'll keep walking it.